Hey, this is Allie Edwards, and in one of my recent videos, I talked about gathering some questions from you guys recently and having a new series set up here called Storytime, and that's what we're going to do today. All right, so in this episode of Storytime, we're going to talk about something that is probably one of the questions that I get asked most often. If it's not, I don't know if it's the most common one, it's probably definitely in the top 5. And that question is, how do I tell hard stories? How do you tell a hard story? And when I recently requested questions from the community on Instagram, I got 6 questions that related to this, which was, and I'm just gonna read through those and then we're gonna talk about this topic generally. So, how do you approach telling very specific but hurtful stories? How do you be vulnerable with your stories when you know others will read them? So the idea of vulnerability, I think, definitely related to telling stories that are more challenging. How to capture the super private stories to share with my kids when they're older. How do I write sad stories? And how do you handle writing about trauma or something very sad in your life? Now, the first thing that I always like to say about this topic is a very gentle reminder that there is no requirement for you to include traumatic and very challenging stories in your memory keeping. There's no requirement. This is, again, another one of those things where there's not a right or a wrong. And I have some very specific ways that I look at this and ways that I've decided over the years whether or not to include specific stories. So the first thing then is that reminder that you don't have to tell every single story. Like, to be a good documenter or a good memory keeper or a good scrapbooker, and this is like lots of quotations here, you absolutely 100% don't have to tell every story. So I want everyone out there listening to this right now to release that pressure from yourself. Release the pressure of telling the happy stories, the sad stories, just all of those stories. There's no way that you could ever document every single story in your life. And I think once you give yourself that permission that you're gonna let go of that expectation, it gives you a lot more options for choosing how and when and why you might want to tell certain stories. So once you have relieved yourself of the pressure that you need to tell all your stories or you need to tell all of the hard stories, then you can actually decide for yourself, what kinds of stories do you actually want to tell? And this is all a part of my answer to telling the hard stories. And we'll talk more specifically about that in a minute, but I think we have to step back and we have to start with that reminder that you don't have to tell all the stories. And then you get to decide. Number 2 is you get to decide what kinds of stories do you want to tell. Do you want to tell, the highest highs and the lowest lows? What kinds of stories do you want to include in your memory keeping adventures? And I think that this is a question that's really important for each one of us to individually identify what kinds of stories are important to us and what kinds of stories do we want to include. Okay, so after you have thought about those first 2 pieces, right? The reminder that you don't have to tell every story, and the reminder that you get to decide what kinds of stories you want to tell, then if you are someone who says, yes, I would like to include more of the challenging stories of my life in my memory keeping, you do not have to do this, right? But if you want to include more of it, then you get to decide, how do you want to do that? What is the best path forward for you personally telling some of the more challenging kinds of stories? Now, in my experience as a memory keeper and as someone who's done this for a long time, I have found great value in my own life for including some of the more challenging stories. Now, when I do that, it is not always a super long story. It is not always a super detailed story. It is not always a story that includes all of my facts and all of the feelings related to that story, that more challenging story. I absolutely 100% tackle those kinds of stories on a case-by-case basis. And lots of factors go into that. You know, how do I feel about it? How, you know, do I want to include other people in this story? Lots and lots of different things that you can think about on each one of those. So again, reminding yourself that this is a choice that you can make. And then once you decide you want to include those kinds of stories, you kind of have to figure it out for yourself, what's going to make the most sense for you. So there's a couple different ways that you can approach telling the more challenging stories of your life. One of them is to take it out of memory keeping or scrapbooking, as we may look at it today. Take it out of there entirely and instead start a journal for yourself, right? Start a journal where you are able to take advantage of the opportunity to get all of these stories, the hard stories, the easy story, you know, specifically the hard stories, to get them out of your head and onto a page or onto your computer. So one of the ways that I've approached that in the past, especially in things like Project Life, is just giving a nod to the fact that I'm experiencing something challenging without detailing every little bit of that story. So as you flip through my past Project Life albums, you will see cards, pocket cards that say things like, today was hard, or that say things like, I'm struggling right now. I have found over the years that even just putting in those little nods to the fact that I'm in a challenging chapter makes me feel like I'm telling a truer story about my life, my overall life as a whole, especially in Project Life, specifically in that project. Because if you're doing Project Life, you know, so much of it is everyday life kinds of things. You're detailing maybe what you eat or where you go, or, you know, kind of the highs and lows of your week. It feels like a really solid place to add in some of those nods. So you can do everything from, you know, a one sentence nod that says I'm struggling to maybe a little bit longer journaling, you know, on a 3x4 card that says I'm struggling because, and then you give a few little more details. So we've got different levels, right? Here's your first, just the nod to it. Then maybe we have like the prompt where I'm struggling because, and you're adding a little bit more journaling there, to a much longer written out explanation of the things that are hard at any given point in time. Now, one of the things that's hard about, or one of the things that'd be more challenging about telling harder stories in the moment, is that we lack perspective, right? So if you're living through a challenging chapter in your life and you're wanting to include pieces of that in your current documenting, I think that that's probably part of the reason why I find that just giving a nod to it is enough for me to feel like I'm telling you that my life is not always simple and easy and fun and happy and whatever, right? That it is full of the highs and lows, just like everyone else experiences, without having to go into the details. Partly because I know, and this is through my own life experience, that as I move through my life, I gain additional perspective on some of those harder stories. And so a story that is super hard when I'm living through it in the moment may not be as hard in those hardest sense of the word later on, you know, a year from now. So you can always choose to not tell the harder stories until later on, right? Because later on when we tell those stories, we're going to tell them differently probably than we would tell them in the moment. You know, in the moment is probably full of very strong emotion, maybe blame, maybe shame, maybe, you know, all the different things that go into a challenging or traumatic situation. Whereas if we wait 6 months, we wait a year, we wait 5 years, we wait 10 years, when we tell that story, it's going to be different. And different isn't better or worse, different is just different. I think when I look back in my scrapbooks, and I'm looking specifically for times when I have told harder stories or more difficult stories, most of those have been told after the fact. That works for me. That works for me because I'm able to approach it from a different kind of perspective. And oftentimes the perspective that I come at it with is through, you know, what did I learn in that situation? So rather than saying this was a traumatic event that happened to me, or this was this was a very challenging chapter, and here are the details in the moment, it is me looking back and saying, I lived through this. It was something that was hard. And here's what I learned from that, and here's how I'm moving forward in my life after those hard things happened. When we talk about telling hard stories, I absolutely 100% want you to know that I don't have all the answers, right? I am someone here that memory keeps and scrapbooks because it helps me make sense of my life. And it is important for me to include some of those challenging chapters, but I absolutely 100% don't include every single story in my life that has been hard, right? We are a combination of all of those stories that we live through, the hard stories, the easy stories, the happy stories, the highs and the lows. Those are a part of all of our stories. And I think that it's important to give a nod to the times when we're living through more challenging chapters. But really a lot of this depends on how much scrapbooking are you doing, and what are the kinds of stories that you want to tell, and where do you find value, right? Do you find value in stories of gratitude? Do you find value in stories of living through challenging times in your life? Do you find value in celebrating? One of the reasons why I like to use gratitude as a story lens, even for telling harder stories, is that gratitude puts me in a different place, right? And this is part of, I think, why I like to include stories after the fact, include harder stories after the fact, like that I actually do the writing after the fact, because it lets me use different lenses, like lessons learning, like gratitude, to be able to go back in and say, what did I learn from this? What pieces of that challenging time in my life am I actually thankful for? And maybe which ones are still hard. Another thing that you might consider is having a scrapbook or a binder album or a journal, like I mentioned previously, where you document those kinds of stories, right? Where it's not necessarily this is your public consumption scrapbook, but it is a scrapbook that's just for you, right? Or an album that's just for you, that is the evidence of your existence, of the highs and the lows. That might be something that you would want to consider. And I know for many of you that participate in my One Little Word project each year, I think a lot of people use that album as an opportunity to document stories that you are living through right now that might be more challenging, personal development kinds of stories, stories that are impacting you, right? Which can be some of those more traumatic, and those harder stories are impacting us all the time. And for me, that having those specific albums, that One Little Word album, where I can go to each year and have a place, have a home for some of my more challenging stories in whatever way I might want to write them, whether they are, very direct in the moment, this is what's happening right now, or they are the more perspective kinds of stories. Having a home for them is something that's really made a lot of sense to me, and that might be something that makes sense to you too. That's also a way, having a project like One Little Word and an album for that, or just an album that is holding the more challenging stories in your life, is something that, especially like the person who asked about wanting to share private stories with your kids when they're older, that might be an awesome way to tackle that as well, right? Having a scrapbook that contains some of those more challenging stories that is more private for you right now, and that maybe you don't share on the internet, but that may be something that's really important for your kids to know about you in the future. Or if you are somebody that doesn't have kids, right, it's just a place for you to process your own stories, to write about your own stories in whatever way makes sense to you. I think that also hits on that question of vulnerability. If you have a project that is private, an album that is private, you can be more vulnerable. It's more for you to process, for you to make sense of your life, and then potentially for future generations to be able to look and see, what were the high points in your life, what were the low points in your life, and how did you deal with them, right? That can be a part of telling those stories as well. Now, in terms of the nitty-gritty of actually writing down those hard stories, I am a big believer in, getting out a journal or something where you can write by hand and have it be messy and have it really capture the in the moment feelings if you're needing to get those out. I have definitely benefited in my life from taking that opportunity to be like, okay, there's too much going on in my head right now. I need to get those out. And it's literally pen to paper, and it's literally just writing. It's writing the mess, right? It is writing the things that I'm really mad about, and there's probably swear words, and there's probably, you know, things that aren't true, and there's probably, you know, just me being mad about whatever it is and needing to get those things out. There is definite value in that. So that is one way that you can approach getting that out. And again, finding a home for that, right? Or writing it down and then throwing it away or burning it or doing something like that, especially when you're living in the moment. And then later on, you can come back, and if you want to write that story again, you're going to probably write it from a different perspective. Now, let's say you want to do some writing on maybe some past challenging events in your life. And you're going to do it from a place of perspective, right? And you want to go back in and you want to document some of those kinds of things that were maybe hard in your childhood or hard in your college years, or, you know, whatever pieces of your story that you might want to include. When you find yourself ready to do that, it can still be really hard, right? It can be really hard to speak your truth, to write your truth. It can be, you can feel like you're reliving some of the pieces of that story. It can feel messy in your head. And I think that my encouragement to everybody, and what I tell myself when I'm trying to write a story like that, is honestly to just do the best that I can. I often ask myself, you know, what is the angle that I want to come at in this story? And this is when it gets back to that gratitude or the lessons learned. Lessons learned is an entry point for me. You know, what did I learn through this challenging story? Yes, I'm ready to write about this challenging story. So what did I learn about it? I like to have that kind of an angle versus just like, here is the story of this really hard thing that happened to me. The end. Like, for me, having an angle that I come at it with of what did I learn through the process of that. And I think that a lot of times I actually don't write about some of those more challenging pieces in my life until I'm able to identify some of the things that I've learned through the process of making it through that experience. I think that that's really true for me. So as with all storytelling, you start with one word, right? You start with one word, and then the next word, and then the next word. And remember that when you're telling challenging stories, you can go back to all of the other storytelling tips that we've used in the past, like, you know, lists. If you're wanting to tell a story of something hard that happened to you, you know, maybe even using a prompt. I'm looking outside because I'm thinking as I'm talking to you guys. You know, use a prompt like, this was hard because, and then write a little bit. This was hard because, this was hard because, or here's the background. ... Whenever we talk about writing it, and I know for me especially too, I always, you know, my default is writing in paragraphs. My default is academic writing, but we don't have to write like that in our scrapbooks. That's one of the best things about it. So thinking about different ways that you can start your story, different ways that you can approach it. This was hard because, this was hard because, you know, or here's the details. Like maybe you want to start with facts and feelings, which is something else I talk about often. Start off with the facts about this challenging story in your life, and then, you know, have the facts be first and then have the feelings be second. So they can get at those facts first. Maybe you want to document, this is when it happened. This is my memory of what happened. You know, these are the kind of surrounding circumstances, and then go into, this is how I feel about it. Maybe you talk about, this is how I felt about it in the moment. And then this is how I feel about it now. And then maybe these are some of the lessons that I've learned about it. Give yourself a little bit of structure. You can create your own structure for any of these kinds of stories that you want to tell, whether they're happy stories or sad stories or whatever. You get to decide, and there's lots of different ways that you can approach that. But coming back at it, you know, with list style journaling, that is always something that you can do and is an entry point, I think, for telling harder stories. So as I wrap up this video, I want to say a couple things. One is that I 100% find value in making sure that the stories that I tell are real, right? In terms of that they represent different pieces of my life, the wonderful happy pieces, but also the more challenging pieces. I don't want my kids to ever look at the albums that I've done and think that I, you know, am not in some way acknowledging that there were challenges, or acknowledging that I made mistakes, or acknowledging that, you know, that life was imperfect, because that is the way that it is. And so I definitely have always held the view that I wanted to have a combination of those kinds of stories in my scrapbooks. But I also am not the person that is ever going to write out a story when I am very emotional, when I am very angry, when I am very upset, and put that in my scrapbook. That would be, if I needed to do that kind of writing, I would do that in a private journal or in some other way that it wasn't in the scrapbook. And I want to make that okay for people to differentiate between those kinds of stories and have that be okay, right? And so that you don't feel the pressure that you have to include every single story, but that if you want to, and if you feel that desire to add in some more of that realness, that can be an option for you. I have a feeling that this is probably a topic that we can come back to again and again in this series as well. So if you have additional questions for me on this topic, I'm happy to answer them. You can ask them in the comments below. I really just want you to remember that there isn't a right or a wrong, and there isn't a prescription for writing the more challenging stories in your life. You can do it in a million different ways, and you can choose to not do it, and you can still document lots of different pieces in your life, or you can choose to just say, this chapter was hard, this month was hard, this day was hard, and that can be enough. Thanks so much for watching. See you guys back here again soon.